The UFC heavyweight division might genuinely be cursed because just after a few years of Francis Ngannou's departure from the UFC, we have another heavyweight champion who finds himself surprisingly in a very similar position. And this time, one of boxing's biggest promoters is inserting himself in this conversation and isn't holding anything back. When Francis Ngannou left the UFC, most fans thought this would just be a one-time situation and that maybe Francis was genuinely just the problem. A heavyweight champion at the peak of his powers in his athletic prime, walking away from the biggest MMA organization on the planet.
He offered Francis a deal that would have made him the highest paid heavyweight in the history of the company. More than Lesnar, more than anybody. And he turned the deal down.
When this news came out, it was a shock to everybody, and it wasn't expected. But Francis wasn't just asking for more money. He was pushing for things like sponsorship freedoms, like when the UFC used to allow people to have the sponsored banners and the sponsored shorts. But he also wanted better fighter protection. He wanted long-term security for these fighters. And the UFC just wasn't willing to give it to him. So he left. He signed with the PFL. I think he had one fight there, and then now he's fighting for MVP. He boxed a few times. But let's hop in our Marty McFly. Instead of going back to the future, we're gonna go forward. You have to fast forward today. And while Tom Aspinall's situation isn't identical, there are some very big similarities that are just extremely impossible to ignore. Once Tom finally became the undisputed heavyweight champion after winning the interim belt against Sergey Pavlovich at UFC 295, he waited months for John Jones, a negotiation that dragged on forever and a fight that ultimately never happened. And eventually, it led into John Jones's retirement. And whether you think John Jones outright ducked Tom Aspinall and retired to not fight him, or that he just didn't want to fight him anymore, that was the biggest heavyweight fight that we could have ever seen, and it just didn't happen. Now you fast forward to present day 2026. We now have reports and comments surrounding Tom Aspinall's contract that have sparked a bigger discussion. And it's not because Tom wants out of the UFC, but because many people believe that he's being massively underpaid to what his value is actually worth. And one of those people is Eddie Hearn, and he is not being quiet about it.
Eddie Hearn's been talking again this week. He says he won't let Tom Aspinall fight under the current terms of his UFC contract. He signed a management contract with him. What's your response to that?
You said they want him released, right? Okay, you release Bam Rodriguez then. Sounds pretty stupid, doesn't it? Congratulations again, Eddie. You sound stupid again.
The boxing promoter has reportedly talked about how shocked he is when he learned about Tom Aspinall's pay and compared to the revenue he generates to that position and the area he holds in the sport. Hearn has blatantly said a heavyweight to Tom's caliber should be earning more than he is right now. And that statement immediately created tension. Now, for years, Eddie Hearn and Dana White have never really seen eye to eye, and they have traded shots back and forth, like through interviews, nothing in person. Eddie Hearn has pushed for multiple crossovers between the UFC and boxing, and now Zuffa boxing and the big names, the WBCs. And Dana White wanted none of it, wanted nothing to do with it. And despite all the talk of boxing, Dana has always preferred to keep things under the UFC umbrella, which makes sense with Zuffa boxing, right? He doesn't want to fall under the Muhammad Ali Act. He doesn't want to bring in people from he doesn't want to unify belts like they do in the other promotions. And that's where everything becomes more interesting because we are seeing the UFC become more and more involved in other combat sports, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the boxing now, power slap. It's no longer just MMA. And that is where Conor Benn comes in play. They signed him to a one-fight deal, and they are very open to actively exploring other boxers, and they've signed other boxers. And now suddenly, some of the criticism that Dana used to dismiss is becoming harder to ignore. For example, fighter pay, $10 million for one fight, but we can't pay our heavyweight champion. And that is where Eddie Hearn comes into play now. Eddie Hearn, whether you like him or not, is good for the sport. He is not afraid to stand up to Dana White and let him know that there's no reason not to pay these guys more. That's what you have to understand. When nobody is going to challenge Dana White in the machine that is the UFC, there's never change. But when you have an outside promoter and Eddie Hearn, who is very open and starts questioning fighter pay, you are starting to loop the fans into it and it's starting to create pressure. And when pressure is created, we start to see progress. And if we break it down mathematically and into numbers, the UFC is worth $7.7 billion. Yet every entry level fighter is starting at a 12 to show, so 12,000 to make weight, and then 12,000 to win. Now, if we just do the math, right? I didn't do the math. I'm not going to try to pretend that I did. My chat did. ChatGPT. Shout out Jarvis. If you're not nice to your AI, they're coming for you. Be nice to your AI. Besides the point, let's say the UFC increased the pay to 25,000 to show and make weight and 25,000 to win. Assuming we have about, let's say, 30 debuting fighters per year, that would cost, I mean, it would cost well under $1 million. Now you compare that to 7.7 billion valuation, and we're talking about a tiny fraction of a percent, a literal rounding error in your company. You could lose $1 million a year being a $7.7 billion company and wouldn't realize it for a very long time. Now, obviously, fighter pay is extremely more complicated than just black and gray. Let's change the payment and change how we do things. Businesses aren't valued based on cash sitting in your bank account, and there are countless other expenses that we don't see as fans. You know, the PI costs a lot, the promotion costs a lot. You have hundreds of thousands of employees. There's fees for everything. But the larger picture still remains. The UFC has never been stronger financially. Yet the fighter pay continues to be the biggest topic this company gets to date, which brings us right back to Tom Aspinall. This really isn't about one contract. It's about a pattern. Francis Ngannou had issues. Now people are questioning Tom Aspinall's deal. The heavyweight division keeps producing these champions who become central figures in the fighter pay conversation, right? Again, John Jones, he wanted the egregious amount of money, $30 million. I believe Stipe Miocic wanted the new contract at one point. Tom Aspinall wanted a new contract at one point. Francis Ngannou. And I think the reason that is because the heavyweight champions have leverage that other fighters simply don't. And that's because they bring in the eyes. And you're going to tell me John Jones, when he was at heavyweight, and that's John Jones' name value. Everybody wants to watch him. Cain Velasquez, Brock Lesnar. You know, there's obviously some forgettable heavyweight champions. Tom Aspinall is a big name. These guys deserve to be paid a certain amount. And the question I always ask, and the question now for the UFC is whether it decides to evolve. Because if you're letting fighters like Tom Aspinall, who continues to win, continues to grow their fan base, and continues attracting support from powerful figures outside of the company, the question becomes is when does it end? When do we pay these fighters what they are deserving? When do we pay these fighters the proper amount? Dana White recently said that, do I have to pay you $370,000 to figure out if you belong in the UFC? No, Dana. You do not have to pay someone the starting salary of a WNBA player who brings in significantly less views. But the reason those players get paid so much is because they scout properly. If you don't scout properly, then you pay them lower. You can't use that as an excuse. And Dana and the UFC, until we get these situations handled, these conversations are not going away anytime soon. Hey, if you guys stuck around this whole time, I appreciate it. This is like my first kind of like, the people call it a video essay. I just call it a longer form of TikTok ranting. I just, with everything going on with Tom Aspinall, that's kind of what, I wanted to say. And if it sounded scripted, it's my first one. But yeah, I don't know. I enjoy that. I enjoy doing things like this. I know I'm going to get better collectively about talking and being more or less robotic. I tried to add some of like my old words in there and I kind of lost track. So if it's choppy, deal with it. But shout out for watching the whole thing. We're gonna try to do one video a week. We might spam a lot, but one video a week, bare minimum. Let's go.